Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and it's a little late, but I'm going to talk today about The Crisis of the European Mind, 1680 to 1715 by Paul Hazard. It's been difficult to figure out how to make this presentable, as seems to be perennially the case for me, but I'm just going to jump right in, I guess. So it's a work of intellectual history, right? I think that history is really important. I don't do a lot of history on the channel. I should do more. I should read more. I think history is extremely important. That it's sort of vastly underrated and underappreciated and understudied, and that people's historical education is really poor, and that this is sort of catastrophic in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think that intellectual history in particular is very cool. It's similar. I've been mostly into theory, so intellectual history is more like sort of touching on theory, the development of theory and stuff like that. And I think that in some sense the history of philosophy, for example, is philosophy. That your conception of the sort of historical process of philosophy, it necessarily entails, determines your philosophical picture of the world, right? That these two things can't be sort of decoupled from one another. And so studying the history of philosophy, understanding it, forming an understanding of it, in some sense, is doing philosophy in my mind. Yeah. This isn't about philosophy, but there's a lot of philosophical debates that are big here. Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Leibniz, all these guys feature pretty heavily here. But yeah, so this period doesn't really correspond to anything specific in history as a discipline. It's not a specific period. It's definitely post-Renaissance. It's like early modern, sort of early Enlightenment. We're like at the tail end of the scientific revolution, transitioning into, full-blown Enlightenment, and then Industrial Revolution and things like that. I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about the 17th century, the 17th century, and what's going on in the 17th century, and what the sort of historical, political background of this book is. And so the 17th century is an era in Europe of religious conflict, lots of religious conflict, right? The Reformation began in 1517, and there's basically been religious fighting since then, okay? The zenith of the Reformation is about 1590, and at that time, Protestants controlled about half of Europe. And then you have the Counter-Reformation, reconquests, and within the next 100 years, by 1690, part of our period, the influence of Protestants in European political geography dwindles down to about a fifth, okay? But yeah, the Reformation begins in 1517. About 100 years later, 1617, you get the 30 Years' War, 1617 to 1647. And this war is incredibly destructive. About 20% of the southern European population died during this war. In some areas where fighting was most intense, it was closer to 50%. After the Westphalian Peace, Europe gets sort of divided into Protestant and Catholic powers. You get Huguenot rebellions in France in the 1620s. Henry IV had died about a decade earlier, and he had protected Protestants with the Edict of Nantes. After his death, Protestants become increasingly persecuted until eventually the Edict of Fontainebleau, which is huge in this period of time. It's a huge influence on what's going on in this book. And the Edict of Fontainebleau is a revocation of the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes was designed to protect Protestants from political persecution. You get from the dragoons, right? The Edict of Fontainebleau revokes that. Now political persecution is back on the menu. If you're a Protestant, you have to convert or flee, okay? And this led to a lot of Protestants leaving France, going to Holland, and really creating a cottage industry of venom against monarchy and against the Catholic Church. They're connected. They're connected in, for example, the concept of the divine right of king. They're also connected in terms of somebody like in the figure of Louis XIV, because Louis XIV is sort of the last absolute monarch in Europe, and he's Catholic. He represents, sort of the Catholic vision of what a state is, what power is, what authority is. Holland was already Protestant at this time, and it was already sort of famous for this kind of invective against, Catholicism and monarchic absolutism, right? Louis XIV at this time was probably the most powerful political figure in Europe. After defeating the Dutch in the Franco-Dutch War of 1678, he's sort of de facto biggest man in Europe, right? They become the strongest state in Europe. The most influential state in Europe during this time is France. And we see geographically during this period actually a movement culturally and intellectually of the center of Europe. It had been Spain and Italy in the south of Europe. It has moved up to France, right? Sort of right before this period. And it's transitioning to Holland and to England, right? And so this is also a movement sort of from the center of Catholicism out into the center of Protestantism. This is crucial to understand for what's going on here. I'm sorry that it's just historical. I don't know if hopefully you guys are interested. I think that it's very important. So the monarchic principle and Catholicism are both dominant here because they're both dominant in France. France is the dominant country in Europe, and it's becoming increasingly intolerant of Protestants. Right? It allowed the Huguenots to practice their religion without state interference, granting them a kind of freedom of conscience, and then it gets revoked. Huguenots flee. Louis claims that the population of Protestants in France at this time goes from about 1 million to maybe 1,500, and they're fleeing to England and the Dutch Republic. And the Dutch Republic having been already defeated by France, for example. They don't like France anyway. And Holland, the Dutch Republic, they become the center and symbol of religious tolerance in Europe. In England, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes also creates a lot of backlash, which means anti-French sentiment, anti-Catholic sentiment, which are tied together. The important theme of this work to me is the way that political and theological debates are connected, and that political movements are in some sense ultimately theological movements, right? And that the consequences of these kinds of debates spin out into psychology, morality, historical thinking, everything, right? So anti-French sentiment and stuff becomes big in England during this time as well, and then they become suspicious of their own Catholic monarch, suspicion of monarchy in general, right? More suspicious. They had already had, as I said, like the Restoration. They already had the Commonwealth of England. But after the Restoration, they have this Catholic monarch at this time, right? And they become more suspicious of him. All these things are tied together. Eventually, this leads to the 9 Years' War, which basically in Europe is everybody against the French. And then you get the deposing of the Catholic monarch in England. He's replaced by the Calvinist Protestant William of Orange, who was the de facto Dutch ruler. And so this is seen as a victory for Protestantism and for parliamentarism. And then you get things immediately like the Bill of Rights. There's an attempt after this at restoration of the proper line of succession by the Jacobites, and they're backed, of course, by Louis XIV, but it fails. And that's an attempt, obviously, again, to stress this, at restoring the hereditary monarchy and Catholicism. Right? And so Protestantism at this time gets associated with individualism, private faith, the study of the Bible as an individual, the application of individual reason to the study of the Bible. And so it's associated with certain political tenets like individual choice, freedom of conscience, anti-authority, anti-monarchy, secularism, parliamentarism, right? All this stuff is very important to keep in mind during this period. Now, to give you a little more historical background, right? That's sort of the immediate religious conflicts and things like that are going into Europe. That's the background. That's what we're going into in 1680. After at the end of the 30 Years' War, things kind of calm down a little bit, but you still get little religious conflicts all over the place. As I was just talking about, reconquests and things like that are occurring. So you still get little ones, but you don't get this huge conflagration again, right? So there's a kind of relative peace, right, prior to 1680 when our story sort of begins. But so we're at the tail end of what's called the scientific revolution. Also, Galileo is using his telescope and making discoveries by the second decade of the 17th century. We have Francis Bacon's Novum Organum and the advent of the experimental method and its importance. We have the microscope, the discovery of human cells and circulation. Newton's Principia is written in 1687, actually, which is during our period. It's very important. You got the Mayflower in 1620. Like I said, the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, which is generally thought of as the birth of the idea of the modern sovereign nation state. In England, to go back there for a second, the English Civil War ends in 1651, right? The Restoration, 1660. The Glorious Revolution, William of Orange becomes the King of England. That happens 1688 to 89. So that's during our period, and is essential. This is the story of Anglo dominance, right? And it's basically an invasion and a coup by the Dutch. The Dutch, who again had been this center and symbol of religious tolerance and anti-Catholic sentiment in Europe, anti-French. He's a Protestant. And you get the Bill of Rights. So that's some of this sort of immediate political kind of background. Let me see if I'm missing anything real quick. I think that should be fairly good. Okay. So so you get all this scientific revolution, you get all this scientific development as you're getting anti-Catholic sentiment, as you're getting this religious fracturing and these theological disputes, you're getting terrible wars that are related to religion, right? And that are connected then to these theological disputes, bringing in the political sphere, showing that there are real life political stakes in the outcomes of theological disputes, that the type of government is important, etc. and so forth, right? So you get massive sort of intellectual scientific development during this period on the one hand, and it's connected with this really intense theological religious disputes and debates. And so his argument is that this turns this period of time, 1680 to 1715, into a period of real crisis in Europe, a moral and a spiritual crisis. And this is a period in which he says values get inverted and a new type of ideal type of human being is created. There's a massive transformation of consciousness going on in the way that people think about religion and politics, and these two things as being together. And then necessarily about truth, about man, the place of man in the world, and things like that. And he says that during this period, this is where the French Revolution really begins in some sense. And he says, let it be recognized once more that virtually all the intellectual views and ideas, which as a whole were to culminate in the French Revolution, had already taken shape even before the reign of Louis XIV had ended. The social contract, the principle of the delegation of power, the right of subjects to rebel against their rulers, all these things were already ancient history by 1760. Okay? And he also says, the great clash of ideals occurred before 1715, even before 1700. And all the so-called daring utterances of the Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, pale into insignificance before the aggressive audacities of people like Spinoza and Jean Talleyrand. And this is when you get, monumentally influential stuff for the Enlightenment, like Locke's two treatises, like the Letter on Toleration. When are those written, by the way? They're written right after and to justify, to legitimize this coup that of the Glorious Revolution that puts William of Orange in power, right? So again, what's happening that's really important in philosophy and political philosophy, right, is part of this story about England coming to dominance, Protestantism coming to dominance, anti-Catholic sentiment, etc. I'd actually really like to compare a lot of the history of what's going on here to the history that Sloterdijk presents as part of this sort of dialectic of cynicism, because I think a lot of what's going on here is actually just cynicism and the development of cynicism. For example, a big one being, and we'll talk about it more in depth in a little bit, but Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. And notice again, Theologico-Politicus, right? It is essential to understand that the political debates and the theological debates are one and the same. They're two halves of the same coin, two sides of the same coin. The Tractatus was published in 1670, actually, right before this. But it's a huge part of the background of what's going on here. People are responding to him, right? It was published, I think, in Holland, and he's part of this Holland anti-monarchy, anti-Catholic sort of propaganda mill, right? Arguing against those things. And he gets called the arch destroyer, iconoclast, etc. of this period. His name literally becomes a synonym for atheism. So he's extremely important here and part of the background of what's going on. So is Descartes, even though, again, when we're talking about Descartes died in 1650, so it's prior to this period. However, as Hazard explains, by this period, Cartesianism had become the de facto philosophy of the Dutch universities, right? So this sort of intellectual center of Protestant, anti-Catholic, free speech, freedom of conscience, tolerance sort of place in Europe. Philosophically, the background there, what dominates is Cartesianism. So Descartes is, he sort of is a towering figure in all of what's going on here too. Locke is also obviously reacting to Descartes, and so is Spinoza. And so there's a period of radical innovation and transformation here, and so Hazard actually thinks about it like kind of a second Renaissance, except that he calls it a Renaissance without a smile. It's an unhappy Renaissance. It's a sad Renaissance. Whereas the previous Renaissance was, light and joviality and the optimism and sort of the beauty and fun of discovery and all this kind of stuff. This is a kind of second Renaissance in which really it's cynical. We could just say that it's cynical. That's the way that I think about it. But yeah, so we get, rationalism, an era of tolerance. The gentleman and the warrior type are obsolescing and being replaced with the merchant as an ideal. You get a movement from divine to natural law, right? Thinking about people like Grotius and Pufendorf, who comes after him. Grotius arguing, for example, that we need to think about natural law as though there is no revelation. We need to treat them as two totally separate things. And when we're thinking about politics and law and right, we need to be thinking about nature, right? There's a movement from what he says is the sort of the transcendental to positivism, right? He says that, where is this here? He says, and we can see that, the sort of movement from transcendence to positivism happening all over the place here. He talks about Pufendorf as an example of that in law, Richard Simon in biblical exegesis, we'll get to this stuff, Locke in philosophy, Shaftesbury in ethics, and that all of these represent crucial moments and tendencies to move away from the transcendental ideas to positivist ideas, basically. Reason goes from being a mediating power imposing an order based on accommodation, compromise, give and take, right? That's revealed, that's true, right? And it becomes a critical force whose main duty is to inquire, examine, question, right? And this is part of this transition also in the ideal type from gentleman to bourgeois. But yeah, efforts during this period, interestingly also, at reuniting Protestants and Catholics, and there's quite a few of them. Leibniz is really big there, but it always seems to devolve to questions of authority, right? And this again shows the intimate linkage of the political and the theological, because they're talking about the authority of the church. You also have divine right of kings and things like that. You have some nations which are Catholic, some which are Protestant. The Protestant rejection of authority and things like that, tradition, their goal here really then is not just religious, it's fundamentally political. They're anti-authority, anti-tradition. Therefore, individualism, universalism, the power of reason and science to discover the universal, to discover truths that are binding, right? That have no necessary relationship to revelation whatsoever. Ironically, though, reason unmoored from tradition and authority, as Bossuet, who I regard as sort of the hero of this book, as I said in the previous video, when reason is unmoored from these things, you really wind up not being able to know anything. You wind up not believing anything without authority. Ultimately means simply not believing anything. It means Peronism. And it's this Peronist frenzy and criticism then that then gets associated with reason and that dominates the age, that turns on itself. Pierre Bayle, who's sort of the archetype of the free thinker, he's struggling in this period to try to avoid Peronism from the free-thinking perspective, and I think that he fails. He ultimately fails. And that Bossuet is correct. Bossuet is always correct. And yeah, this Peronism gets associated with religion and politics, and also philosophy, morality, psychology, the arts, as we'll see. All of these things are connected. Critique of monarchy is critique of Catholicism, is critique of authority, is critique of tradition, is critique of the old morality, the old type of man, history, the classical canonical works and methods and styles of the arts, right? The Protestants want to emphasize the self, the rationality of the self, truths that we ascertain privately. They believe in the power of individual reason, and then and then the free thinkers are sort of carrying out all the implications of this, moving away from the transcendent. And the free thinkers, this sort of republic of letters, the progressives of this period, basically, they all come to be viewed as kind of the elite by the end of this period, intellectually and socially. And they start to look with pity or contempt on those who profess religious belief. Deism takes hold in England, which means, the idea that reason should dominate. They preserve the idea of obedience to law, but that obedience then gets recast not as obedience to divine law, but natural law, right? It becomes a scientific, positivistic sort of matter. As I said before, I think that Bossuet is basically the hero of this book. He's a French theologian who's engaged in all these debates. He throws his whole intellectual might and vigor into them. I want to start reading him on my own, just sort of alone. I've never read I had never heard of him before this book, or Pierre Bayle, or a number of these figures. But I want to start reading him. He seems awesome from everything that that has been said about him in this. But so he's trying to save tradition, the church, authority, the concept of authority, the monarchy. He's characteristic here. He's very important. Hazar says that basically what happens in this transformation of the European mind is that before 1680, Europeans thought like Bossuet. And then, the next day, all of a sudden, they're thinking like Voltaire. It's a radical shift in consciousness. I forgot to say in the last video, by the way, that the reason why I started addressing those questions and thinking about that is that in these debates that Bossuet is having with all these different free thinkers, and he's really the main one that, he really tries to engage everybody seriously. But in all these debates, what it looks like is that there's a kind of shallowness in the free thinkers' conception of the world, right? They sort of abandon metaphysics. They're abandoning metaphysics for, the scientific or something like that, for the natural, for perception, immediacy, empiricism, things like that, right? They just decide we can't know anything about any of these things. It's all just mystery. It's just a mess. Nobody can know anything. Set it aside and forget about it. And so they're really like metaphysically naive, I think, philosophically naive. But yeah, so that's why I was addressing those questions. But yeah, Bossuet, I think, tends in the nature of these debates to just be correct. He's much deeper. He's more insightful than his opponents. And he presages a lot of what happens in the counter-enlightenment. And then the counter-enlightenment evolves, I think, into phenomenology, historicism, postmodern philosophy. So Bossuet, I think, is really brilliant, and we're kind of living in his shadow, I think, philosophically in a lot of ways. And he just always seems to be right. If you read this book, time and again, like, he'll be offering some prognostication. Like, if you let individuals decide religion, right, religious issues, they decide about religious issues on their own, then they'll obviously start thinking they can decide political issues on their own. They'll obviously start thinking that they can decide moral issues on their own. And that's exactly what we see in this period. He's exactly correct, right? He says that once you abandon the idea of authority, you're just going to wind up with infinite factionalizing, right? Which, again, just turns out to be true. You get Catholicism, and then you get Catholicism and Lutheranism, and then you get Calvinism and Methodism and Presbyterianism, and it's just infinite, right? Why is it infinite? Because they can't defer to some central neutral authority to resolve these disputes, right? They don't have any neutral arbiter, and so every debate, every dispute just has to lead to division, right? That's just the way that it is. He's always correct about these things. And he understands that reason cannot found a worldview. Rationality alone cannot produce a moral universe, cannot discover a moral universe, right? We can't know everything. There are no bedrock axioms to discover. Every axiom entails 1,000 other unfounded presuppositions. He's already saying this stuff. There are unfathomable mysteries, complexities that cannot be completely unfurled. And Europeans largely agree with this sort of thing until this period. And then all of a sudden it's the spirit of Voltaire which is dominant as the outcome of all these debates, as the outcome of the efforts of these free thinkers, these new ideas, this political theorizing, theological movements. This transformation isn't to do with anything material, Hazard says, but actually it is moral and intellectual forces that govern men. And we see here a revolution of the mind occurring and of the moral universe. And that leads to political and material transformation. And the political and religious and material world that we inhabit today is its offspring. Okay, I think I can move on. Okay, so I'm going to start talking a little bit more, starting to get into sort of the actual ideas and what's going on with the ideas in this period. Hey everybody, I'm back. I hope that wasn't too hard of a cut, but I'll just jump right back into it. I had to go get my son. But anyway, another thing about the 17th century is that in the 17th century, there's really an explosion of like international missionary work. Missionaries are in Asia, Africa, the New World. The European colonization of the Americas really begins in earnest in the 17th century. And you're translating the Bible into different languages, trying to convert people. That's what's going on. It meets with serious resistance in some places like Japan. But in general, this process leads to a lot of thinking about foreign countries, peoples, traditions, morals, religion, different psychologies, norms, political forms, histories, right? Historical accounts. And so this invariably leads to the question of who's right, when things conflict, right? So, and there's an explosion in this period of travel literature, and people are reading travel literature. So you're reading about, the Chinese people and, Native Americans and stuff like that, and the way that they do things, the way they think about things. Different historical accounts, like the Egyptian history is much longer, right? It's a much longer perspective than we have based on the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? The Chinese, again, we're like with everyone, we're talking about different time scales. Sometimes stuff contradicts, different accounts. There's a presentation of something that's radically different, and so Europeans are faced with this question as more and more people are interacting with this kind of literature and thinking about these kinds of cultural differences. They're comparing. They're asking, are we correct? Is what we're doing, is the way we think about things good? Is it right? Is it correct? Are our traditions producing better kinds of people? Right? And so there's this kind of crisis of faith in our own tradition and in our own culture that is really maybe not begun right now, but really exacerbated, right? It really kicks up. It becomes democratized in some sense, right? And then, so how do you answer that question? How do you answer the question of whether these norms are better than these norms, this culture is better than this culture, these traditions are better than these traditions? It's can reason judge on that question, right? Is reason really possible of determining whether these two fundamentally different, incompatible worldviews, that ours is better than theirs or theirs is better than ours? Is it capable of doing that? What does it mean to even set up a different tradition beside our own and compare it in this way as though they're equals on an equal playing field, and reason can just sort of neutrally arbitrate about which one's better, right? That already expresses a kind of deep suspicion, cynicism, criticism, skepticism about our own tradition. And then, so this is what's going on in this period. Eventually you get in 1708, for example, people like Oakley saying, so far as the fear of God is concerned, the control of the appetites, prudence, sobriety in the conduct of life, decency and moderation in all circumstances, I declare that if the West has added one single iota to the accumulated wisdom of the East, my powers of perception have been strangely in abeyance. As in, not only are we allowing these other cultures to be put on the same level as us and compared as though they're sort of equally plausible alternatives that we could just pick between, subjecting our own culture and traditions and wisdom to doubt, but even performing this comparison and then finding our own tradition wanting, coming up with the conclusion that we're not better. Maybe they're better, And so more and more people see others unlike them, and they wonder how to account for these differences, and they're moving in this direction. Thought becomes increasingly abstract as a consequence, and people are reaching for the universal. They want to find something that's not just parochially European or Christian, but is true universally, a universal account of morals or something like that, right? So it attacks parochial ideas, and then it starts questioning even itself. What is lacking in these people is any idea of how to handle these problems methodically. They search here and inquire there, but they're never really getting any definite response because reason can't provide one. We're hungry for knowledge, and we depart unsatisfied. And so then we arrive at this melancholy conclusion, this really skeptical conclusion, that the only really wise man is the man who knows that he knows nothing. And this leads us into the topic of history. He talks a lot about history. He's a historian, for example. He has this concept of historical Peronism that I really like. And it's he says that it sort of comes about in this period, and it's related to what we were just talking about. We have these different accounts. With the Renaissance, we start taking pagan accounts seriously, right? We start re-engaging with pagan accounts, pagan historical accounts, accounts of values, philosophy, etc. And so that already forms this kind of a basis of some kind of crisis, because we're thinking, who's correct out of the two of us? How do we rectify? There are all these fundamental differences. What can reason say about the matter? But then in this period, with all of this missionary work and things like that, it becomes even much more complicated, because then we're thinking about ancient Greece and Rome. We're talking about the medieval European Christian perspective. We're talking about the Chinese and the Egyptian and the Native American and the Japanese and the Russian and, you know, all these different accounts, and having to try to figure out, you know, which one's true. And when specifically when the historical accounts differ, when there are, you know, if you're talking about the same year and two different, you know, record keeping systems or whatever, and they're saying something radically different that's incompatible, or when one of them is saying, you know, this is the beginning of time or something, and the other one goes back much further, right? What is the historian supposed to do with a situation like that? That's what these people are confronted with at this time. And, you know, so we had sort of taken it on authority that the Christian perspective is correct. And then we start thinking about things like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Herodotus on the one hand and the Bible on the other. And then we get these other historical accounts. And so, you know, efforts to Christianize were accompanied with efforts to understand native languages and religions and histories, and a great documenting of these histories and the different historical perspectives was underway. And part of that meant great familiarity with histories that conflicted, right? We're developing familiarity with different historical accounts that are older than ours. And so this problem of how do we account for the difference arises. And we also get, as part of this, you know, the scientific revolution, attempts to really square all of our dates, events, people, right? There's this impulse to systematize and to determine, you know, with only rationality which one is correct, to develop a precise accounting of the world, right? And so people were doing that and trying to rectify these different accounts, and they were coming up with very different answers, different years for things, different ages for the earth, and they had to think about whether maybe the Chinese accounting was correct or something. And Hazard talks about this process as being really scholarly and boring, all of this sort of attempting to account for historical records and their differences. But this complexity is irresolvable, right? And so they wind up in this position of historical Peronism. And this historical Peronism is especially bad. As he says, they're really scholarly and boring, and he calls them dry as dust, these people doing this work. But he says, actually, this sort of dry as dust activity has more effect on undermining faith in our own tradition and authoritative sources than any Voltaire ever could have, right? If we can't settle the matter of whether even a historical record from our own tradition possesses more validity than any other historical record keeping in any other culture, then you're stuck in this position of just everything is relative, right? We can't decide, we can't know. It's all guesswork. And this is where a kind of cynicism, I think, develops, wherein it's asserted that all these various accounts are just the self-assertions of their authors. They're politically motivated accounts. Does that sound sort of familiar to you? It should. This idea that sort of history is whatever the victors say, right? It's the story of the victors told by the victors. It's the self-congratulation of the victors. It's a calculated deception, right? Historical narratives are essentially lies that are spoken by the powerful to try to help themselves, right? These are the kinds of perspectives that start developing in this period. And out of this morass, you know, we can never really find historical truth. Their view of history, then, as he says, when all is said and done, is a collection of fairy tales when it treats the origin of nations, and it's a collection of fairy tales, they say, in this period. They're treating the origin of nations and their record keepings thereafter as merely a conglomeration of errors, right, that we can't really sort out. And then this kind of skepticism, again, shifts, it moves, it gets deeper, and it gets directed at the Bible too. The Bible, which had been seen as an absolutely true artifact of revelation and an ultimate authority. In this period, you get a whole new era of biblical exegesis that is historical and philological. You get the Socinians, who argue that anything in the Bible that is not rational, that isn't amenable to reasoned cognition, right, ought to be just discarded. These people are rationalists and they're humanists. They're applying Cartesianism. Their idea is if it's not rational, it must not have come from God, right? Reason is the light of God, is the tool that God has given us, is how we're made in God's image. And so if something isn't rational, right, if it doesn't accord with rationality, my own rationality, then it must be a lie, or God didn't intend me to think it, or something like that, right? In this process of transmission of the biblical stories, there's been some kind of interpolation, there's been human error. But this ultimately means, as Bossuet points out, the abolition of the church as a body. And that is what a lot of these Protestants wind up wanting, with the sola scriptura, with salvation by faith alone. But with all this translation of the Bible into different languages and stuff too, as we were talking about, this kind of historicism, questions arise about the translation of the Bible, the accuracy of the translations of the Bible. And so investigations into the genealogy of the texts, possible translation errors and influences, etc. You get people like Richard Simon arguing that Scripture has to be interpreted without any dogma. And that if you're engaged in the interpretation of the Bible and you can come up with multiple interpretations for a passage, you just can't come up with a dogma. You can't determine the meaning of it. You just have to set it aside, right? Whereas for the Catholics, you go with the received tradition of interpretation, of people thinking about this, the authority of the church, right? But for these people, for the Socinians, increasingly for Protestants in general, no external authority can be brought in to interpret, and philological analysis has to be the master tool. And then you get people raising doubts about, for example, Moses as the author of the Pentateuch. New translations of the Bible that aren't just supposed to be a translation into a new language so that it can be read by people who don't speak German or whatever, right? But instead translations that are intended to be more accurate than the ones we're using, more accurate than the ones the Catholic Church uses, for example, that intend to fix what they believe to be kind of gross errors of translation. And so now, again, this skepticism is seeping into even the way we think about the Bible, right? My translation versus your translation. How should this word be translated? Now that's what we're debating, right? Eventually, you even get people like John Toland who call the whole authenticity of the canon into question. And at the same time, all tradition and all authority. Everything has to come under the scrutiny of an all-powerful individual human mind and be tested as to its rationality. Spinoza's Tractatus argues about what the best role for state and religion should be, and it concludes that a degree of democracy and freedom of speech and freedom of religion works best, like in Amsterdam, while the state should be separate from that. The goal of the state is only, he says, to guarantee the freedom of the citizens. Religious leaders shouldn't meddle in politics. He talks about religious thinking in itself as merely prejudicial. He argues that religion is just about obedience, whereas it's philosophy that's about understanding the truth. They're radically separated. Religion, organized religion, that's just obedience, right? It's about politics. Religion is inherently political in that sense. If you want to think about the truth, if you want to engage in serious metaphysical speculation, set religion aside. That's what Spinoza is saying here. He says that everything, including God, including the Bible, is essentially a natural phenomenon and should be studied as a natural phenomenon. Think here, this is a kind of continuation of the Baconian project, right? Of the Newtonian project. Everything has to be done scientifically. Religion now has to be done scientifically. Faith is a natural phenomenon that should be investigated as a natural phenomenon. The Bible is nothing more than any other text of philosophy or history or physics. Miracles, prophecies, etc., these all have natural explanations. That's what Spinoza is saying. He thought all organized religion is only a defense of and for the creation of political power. Again, does this kind of cynicism sound familiar to you? Religion is a tool of the powerful used to oppress the masses and control them, that sort of thing. It should sound very familiar to you. I think this is a very familiar form of cynicism for us. But this kind of thing, like the Tractatus, led to really intense debates and disputes and censures by the church and, political consequences. And then invariably all these debates, again, take on a really political dimension as a consequence. And then it has effects that encompass every aspect of human life. Essentially, we wind up in a situation where skepticism is just the reigning ideology. Tradition is no longer a reason to do anything. The Renaissance revival of pagan philosophy, he says, plants the sort of seed of skepticism. This historical and biblical and religious critique, the advent of Protestantism, swells it. When two different values or ideas contradict, how do you choose? Which tradition, which facts, which morals? We start getting even a separation of morality in religion, psychological morality as a natural phenomenon, morality as a truth, universal, objective, that can be discovered by reason. And you get in this period then the blossoming of a kind of new form of morality, in which the idea is you should live for today. Think about the earthly, right? That sort of idea starts in the Renaissance, but it really reaches its full expression here and its full sort of separation from the church. You can watch my Petrarch video that I made before if you're interested in sort of the Renaissance and Renaissance thinking. But yeah, these people start to think of morality as an essential social matter, a la Locke, right? A good example of this, Locke, for example, turns tolerance into a Christian virtue. In his letter concerning toleration, and again, here we're talking about 1689, 1690. Toleration, he says, is sort of a supreme virtue. But he argues toleration for everyone except the intolerant, and for those who, he says, own allegiance to another priest, or to another prince. Who is he talking about? Catholics. Tolerance is the supreme Christian virtue, he says, and so the intolerant Catholics should be treated very harshly as moral lepers. And again, this is a kind of revolution. This is a moral revolution. Toleration had not been a Christian virtue. If the good is known, if the moral law has been revealed, then what does it mean to be tolerant? To tolerate heresy? To tolerate blasphemy? To tolerate sin? To tolerate that which condemns us? Toleration previously sounded to Christians like a confession that one is in league with error and deception. Why should we tolerate evil? Toleration of what is wrong participates in being wrong. Toleration of sin must itself be a sin. The good must be allied with the good and promote it and defend it. That's the traditional view. Christian duty and charity, in fact, would forbid tolerance. But for people who have come to believe freedom of conscience is an inalienable right, who believe in sola scriptura, right? These attitudes that are developing really in this time, for those people, the idea that we should abandon all the traditions and traditional interpretations of the church and just treat the Bible on its own, in the light of our reason, weigh it ourselves, to that kind of person, tolerance becomes a necessity. And obviously, this again is taking on political dimensions. Catholic rulers need to tolerate Protestants. That's the idea here. But remember, he doesn't say the reverse. And when you and then, so there's this question of, if that's the case, if you should be free to think however you think about religion and you need to be tolerated, right? Then why shouldn't you be free to think about morality and come up with your own conclusions there and be tolerated? About the civic good, about the law, right? That's the end of these sorts of things. That's the kind of argument that Bossuet makes. And the treatise, his treatise is in 1690, and this sort of sanctioned the advent to power of the leading representative of Calvinism in Europe, William of Orange, right? He's sanctifying, in some sense, a new political code, right? Calvinists were his friends. Freedom of conscience then gets transplanted from the religious to the political sphere. To quote Gottfried Arnold, and really hit home the transformation that's happened here, right? Gottfried Arnold in this period says, heretic is the word that we use, that the powerful use for people who get in the way of their exercise of power or diminish their influence. Again, this kind of cynicism is extremely common today. He doesn't refer to this kind of stuff as cynicism in here. That's not the track that sort of he takes, but I think that it's an important way of thinking about it. But yeah, that's the transformation here is sort of completed, right? Heretic has come to refer to, or to be seen as inherently political. Heretic becomes a political category. It's understood as a political category that's applied to people who get in your way, right? The proper heretic then becomes the intolerant, as we're seeing with Locke, the bigot, the doctrinaire. It's the orthodox who are then seen as heretics with their dry, withered hearts, right? In all of this, all of these people, the way that that reason is transformed in this period, the activity that these freethinkers are engaged in, it's all just critical. It's relentless, negative criticism. It's about critique, condemnation. He says they had eyes for the crimes and aberrations of mankind. They had none for their deeds of heroism and devotion. They forgot all about the saints and the martyrs. They assumed in their pride that they had laid bare the whole truth. They had become gods, obeying only themselves or their reason. And he adds, philosophers tend to be very good at knocking down received beliefs. That's what these people are all doing. They're criticizing the world order that they are living in, that they've inherited, right? Again, this is sort of the way that most scholarship, most intellectuals, etc. operate today. They can't build anything. They're only tearing down, right? And he says, but having done so, all they can supply to fill the gaps are notes of interrogation, right? Question marks placed around words for sort of the postmodern, Derridian, deconstructive scholars, right? Kind of ironic distance, right? He says, reason cannot certify anything for anyone. Reason in this period went from being a mediating power to, as we said, merely a critical force whose duty was to inquire, examine, question. It becomes merely about tearing down. That's the whole purpose and function of reason, right? Whereas before, the divine law was revealed and reason was a matter of accommodating the human fallen world, our own behavior and lives and contingent circumstances in the face of the divine law which had been revealed, right? Now it's the world is what it is, and reason has to criticize it from the perspective of natural law or whatever, and then even criticize natural law, right? Who is to decide what nature is? We don't even know what happened last year because there are different accounts of it. And so the changing psychology in this time is associated with the decay of religious orthodoxy and also the appeal of science. There's a war on tradition, a reconstruction of the relationship with the cosmos through empiricism and natural law is ongoing. The development of new metaphysics, new aesthetics. It's all about the moderns overturning the ancients, right? They have a mania for newness, for progress. They want to just abandon everything about our tradition, everything about our history, everything about authority, right? There is no authority. The only authority is my own mind. Tear it all down, and we can build a better world, a perfect world. It's all just been prejudice so far. It's all been prejudice and cynical use of power and exploitation, right? Now we're revealing that element of all this tradition, right? And we're going to tear it down as a consequence, and we'll build something up new. But they have trouble. Locke is trying to battle against Peronism. Bale tried to avoid it. But continually arguing about everything under the sun and then suspending judgment only means in the end immobility. It means death, paralysis. Peronism had been a useful ally politically for these people, for the Socinians, right? But ultimately, it has to mean the annihilation of the will. Locke realizes that, and so he's trying to avoid this, and he turns our attention then to psychological truths, right? He says that reason has to accept some universal elementary data, psychological realities. And the date of his essay marks a turning point in which the subject of man's explorations really becomes the mind itself and its unfathomable riches. There's a shift from the world into the subject, right? These people are, Locke being the best among them, the most actually philosophically serious among them. As I said, most of these freethinkers are totally philosophically naive and unserious. But they're all facing this situation in which they're abandoning the idea of grasping essences behind appearances, right? And so Locke comes along and tries to prevent that from being just nihilism, Peronism, and he thinks maybe we can found a new moral code based on psychological reality. He actually wants to refute the freethinkers and the atheists. He is considered an ally to them and to the deists, and that was painful for him. he was not a fan of them. But so then moving into the area of natural law up to this period had been associated with divine law. In Hobbes, it actually is used to justify monarchy. But the problem of theodicy comes to be seen as a very serious blow against divine law and providence. And so there's this desire to pass from the order of providence to the order of humanity. Spinoza, again, he has this idea that kings are imposters, using religion only to consolidate their unlawful power, right? Grotius had suggested that we need to separate divine and natural law from one another and treat them as different domains. And then Pufendorf, he emphasizes these ideas of political pacts, the duties of men and citizen, common consent about the safety, commonweal security, the welfare of all. And so natural law comes to take place in constitutions, in social life, right? It's immanent to the human social world rather than something transcendent. And it's impossible, he says, for mankind to live together if natural law is not followed. He thinks there's different planes, right? The theological plane and the plane of revelation. After the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, this Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, arguments about the right of princes to use the sword doesn't extend to matters of conscience. That becomes the way that these people talk about this issue at this time. And so they're arguing basically that Louis XIV has placed himself outside of the law because he's outside of the natural law. The idea of divine law, we're setting that aside. The idea of the divine right of kings, we're setting that aside. There's only the natural law. And when political power is used to interfere in matters of conscience, you've moved outside of the natural law. And so now revolt is lawful. You get this idea of lawful revolution. Bossuet very rightly argued that this principle would tend to the overthrow of all empires and the degradation of all dominions set up by God. He thought that all social contract theory was dumb and that there's no way for anarchy to delegate sovereignty. You can't get sovereignty from anarchy, right? So then more about Locke. He became the philosopher of the New Age, right? And he talked about, again, the right of subjects to rebel. He starts with the idea of natural man, just like Pufendorf and everybody else. Fenelon then wrote his, I forget what it was called actually, but he wrote it about how the king's authority is only derived from the people, and absolute power makes one a slave. He's making, in this book, I forget what it's called, I'm sorry, A Defense of Human Rights. And he says, a people is no less a member of the human race, which is society as a whole, than a family is a member of a particular nation. Each individual owes incomparably more to the human race, which is the great fatherland, than to the particular country into which he was born. So you can also see this universalizing political tendency here. We're all one human race. We all need to think of ourselves as one human race. Abolish particularity, right? We're all the same. We're all equal, So this, tends to be, he's also talking about war, right? He's making an argument against war and things like that. Different peoples, different nations shouldn't go to war with one another because they're the same thing, right? They owe more to there's more in common than there is difference. And so they shouldn't fight. We shouldn't have conflict, right? I'm not really a American. I'm a human being, and we're all the same, and we all should have the same rights everywhere. And there's a universal natural law that can be discovered, a universal form of reason that can discover it, and that's what we need to focus on. So you get this kind of political tendency developing here too. This like a kind of what we would call like a like political globalization, right? Internationalism. And then, as we were talking about, they gave up on discovering, right, the essential nature of matter, and so they've come now to regard it as eternally beyond their reach. And so he says, men address themselves then to the task of taking limited stock of their limited domain, which they were still able to call their own, to make the most of that, to put up a comfortable abode there. And again, mostly we're talking about Locke here. To make work less of a drudgery and more remunerative, to increase their well-being, to find themselves better off every day. That now becomes their aim in life, right? They give up on living a good Christian life and thinking about the afterlife and God and things like that. Now it's to increase our general well-being, the general stock of man in this world, right? And who, he says, was to be their guide in the prosecution of this task? Why, the scientist. In this period, the science was becoming an object of worship. All the successes of the scientific revolution lead in this direction, right? And so this view that all of the previous world was an age of darkness comes to really be prominent. That's the way people start thinking about things. And this idea that we're more and more enlightened every day. And science then starts to supplant philosophy, supersede religion. And it's science that's supposed to supply all the answers to all of the longings of the human heart. Materialism and happiness in this life becomes the central issue. Metaphysics is abandoned, and science is supposed to turn the earth into a paradise, not prepare us for paradise, make of earth the paradise. You can think here of Bacon's New Atlantis, right? He has this idea that the lot that God had given to us, the duty, the responsibility, the power, right, was to have dominion over the earth, and we've failed in this. And so Bacon's argument is we can turn earth into heaven, earth into paradise, by fulfilling our duty of making of the earth our dominion. And in doing that, we need to, as he says elsewhere, torture nature to reveal her secrets to us so that we can dominate. We can totally master with reason all of nature, all of the real world. Right? You get more of this idea that man is only a machine, that man as an individual, that men as societies and nations, that our norms, morals, values, all of it should be subjected to the same methods of inquiry as the natural world. It's all part and parcel of the natural world. Man is a machine. Societies are very complex machines. Morals, religion, politics, these are all suddenly scientific, logical problems about which the eye of reason can know everything and systematize and construct universal laws. He finishes the book by starting to describe some of the counterforces that are developing and gaining strength. Right? And some of this also, there's a kind of twofold impact of Locke. One of the impacts of Locke is in this direction, and then you get people like Rousseau, right, who are interested in the passions, right, in my creative powers, in sensation, right, in the aesthetic, right. And so there are these counterforces that are developing also at this time, And I think he associates them within Christian denominations with like quietism and pietism. And they're preparing, he says, for a rebellion of sorts. And that rebellion, basically, that we're thinking about here is the Romanticism and the Counter-Enlightenment. A rebellion that persists today, preserved, as I said, in things like phenomenology, postmodern philosophy, historicism. And it's starting to develop here as a reaction to this sterile, cold, murdering of the world and of the human experience by rationality, by the scientific, right? It's starting to think, right, this Peronist skeptical situation that we're in really sucks, and they're starting to react to that. And so there are people that are starting to be concerned more for beauty, for pathos, for the emotions, the imagination. The imagination previously had been, regarded as crap, right? It's fanciful, it's fantasy, it's nonsense, right? It's mere gobbledygook, right? Only what's rational and logical has meaning to these people. But now we're starting to have a reaction to that emphasizes the powers of the imagination against this kind of totalitarianism of reason. Eventually, this is going to lead to Vico right after our period, for example, as kind of as an early sort of figure of the Counter-Enlightenment. I think Vico's awesome. He looks, not ahead, but back toward the origin, right? Toward the origin of our institutions. Poetic imagination, right? And the history of the development of the poetic imagination. How we have made what we have and are, that we're our collective evolution, right? He thinks man is not an anatomical specimen, but it's the living force pulsates within man and can be discerned in some sense, and that creates kind of this organismic, historical, evolutionary process, right? This is Vico. Marx is very indebted to Vico, for example. But there are people that are starting to think that the need for religion just abides eternally in the human heart, right? And religious people are starting to really sense alarm at this destruction of religion that's going on. And Hazard says, sentiment is conquered in this period by reason, but sentiment declines to accept defeat. Science, in the commonly accepted sense of the term, is progressive. It advances step by step. It's a matter of indefinite future development. In contrast with this, the Theosophists claim that their science is immediate, intuitive, and according to them, it is alone real and authentic. Right? And so you start getting this kind of bifurcation with the Counter-Enlightenment and Romanticism developing here as well. And again, those are also tendencies that are still with us today. But anyway, that's my sort of summary and explanation of The Crisis of the European Mind. I think it's a great book. You should read it. There's a lot more here than what I presented. I tried to not belabor specific debates and things like that too long, or historical events and things like that, because this video would just turn into like a 70-hour video or something. I already think it's too long, but I hope that was fairly good, fairly interesting, fairly informative. I found this book extremely informative and interesting. This historical moment is really important for us to think about and understand. And it's, the source of the modern day in some sense. It's in this period, as he says, we went one day from thinking like Bossuet to thinking like Voltaire, in which the modern man is born, in which the bourgeois type is established as an ideal, in which there's a moral inversion and things like toleration, right, become the key moral, which we see today. And he already has a kind of concept, Locke does, of like repressive tolerance, basically. I didn't mention the arts too much, I guess, but he says also that the arts in this period basically have died, right? Maybe I did say that. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I hope that was interesting and informative. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. I'm probably going to try to do a more like contemporary political theory analysis of the world type thing for my next video. I don't know. And then get back to the Sloterdijk. I don't know. You guys tell me what you think. What's good. Anyway, remember, don't simply react, but think culture.